and you can find the recording on YouTube on our YouTube channel with Florida Sea Grant. I will actually send out now we have some more people coming in. Send up a follow-up email that'll have some resources from today, the link to the recording, and a link to the actual presentation or to resources and the oops and the evaluation. So, welcome everybody to the 2025 Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism webinar series. So, we've actually been doing this for 2 years. We have last year's webinars recorded, and we have topics that ecotour operators can learn from, natural resource folks, volunteers at different kind of wildlife centers to get some really good quality information on topics that might relate to the people that you interact with every day and for you to be able to educate them as well. So click if you can advance the next slide. Awesome. Well, actually, some housekeeping stuff as well. So I ask everybody to mute themselves. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We'll have some time after the webinar to actually ask questions in person. So, make sure you have a couple good ones that you hear from this talk. But a little bit more about the Florida Society for Ethical Ecotourism. It started in 1998 in the Southwest Florida region to establish and maintain professional code of ecotourism ethics in order to encourage awareness and stewardships for Florida natural heritage. So many people are in this state. So many people come to our state to visit these natural areas. So it's up to us to provide, education and proper, tips for stewardship. So it's a third-party certification to make sure that, the ecotour provider you're going to adheres to certain standards and they provide a good group of network between ecotour operators and educational opportunities such as this and annual meetings. So if you are somebody that belongs to that group, please look into joining C. But it's a great network of folks. This is our second year that we put this on. It's put on by Florida Sea and Florida Sea Grant. So I'm an extension agent here in Collier County. Kate Rose, who's the Charlotte County agent, and Carolyn Kovacs in the Volusia St. Johns County, also as part of this webinar series, and they give a couple webinars themselves. So click. And so this brings us up to our guest speaker today. So we have Taylor Ozimek, who's a wildlife biologist with FWC. Taylor Ozimek worked with FWC, the Conservation Commission, studying imperiled and declining species in southern Florida. Taylor has a bachelor's degree in fisheries and wildlife and conservation from Oregon State University. So with that, I will hand it off to her. I mentioned stick around to the end. Please look for that evaluation link, even if you're watching online, and we'll be sure to answer your questions. So, looking forward to a great talk, Taylor. Excited.
Thank you so much. Okay, so like Mike said, my name is Taylor Ozimek. I work with FWC, and majority of my background does come from working with birds. I like to consider myself more of an ornithologist above everything else. And I'm super excited to share a little bit about what I know. And I would like to thank you all for kind of sacrificing your Wednesday night to listen to me yap about birds. I'm very grateful because tonight I hope I can kind of change your tune around them a little bit. I hope I can teach you something that you don't know, maybe enhance something you already know. But regardless, hoping to just kind of highlight these amazing animals that we have and that we have the honor of having so many species come to South Florida. In Florida in general, we have so many shorebirds and seabirds that are native here, as well as those that migrate to our state during the winter, and then even, come and go from areas such as the Bahamas and Cuba. So super excited to be here, and let's jump into it. Okay, first things first, let's get it out of the way. I know when we think about seabirds, the first thing that's going to come to our heads is usually some type of gull species, and usually them being menaces. Um, and it's true, they are they're very opportunistic species. They're obviously omnivores, and they will eat pretty much anything that they can get their bills around. And that does include some of your chips. That does include maybe some ice cream or some food that you leave on the table. But there's so many more, and there's so many more birds that are around the world that are not gulls that actually fill an incredible niche in our marine environment and can actually teach us so much about the world, the environment, and the habitat they live in because they are so incorporated into these environments. So, with that out of the way, let's actually get into it. So, the definition of seabirds and shorebirds can be a little diluted depending on what we're talking about. Seabirds, as defined by NOAA, is a bird species that rely on the marine environment for a significant portion of their life, typically foraging and breeding at sea. So, seabirds as a whole doesn't necessarily mean that they are a specific species or that they fall under a certain family or that they are actually genetically related to one another. Now, that differentiates from shorebirds, which is a diverse group of birds in a specific order, bear with me, called Charadriiformes. Don't know if I pronounced that right. But this includes sandpipers, plovers, avocets, oystercatchers, and phalaropes. And you don't need to know taxonomy. You just need to know that compared to seabirds, shorebirds are actually more genetically related to one another than any type of, when you look at seabirds as a whole globally and shorebirds as a whole. Shorebirds are more genetically related to one another, which is why we see specific characteristics that incorporate every species of shorebird. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But so yeah, they're called umbrella terms for these species because the term seabird doesn't actually pin toward a specific species or order or family. It is just a term that describes a bird that has a significant portion of its life and life history at sea. So, I'm going to start off kind of in a broad view of seabirds because I want you to get excited about them kind of globally as an animal that crosses every ocean we have, as something that has an amazing adaptations and life histories. And then we're going to bring it back down to Florida because most of the ones out there, you're probably not going to see an albatross when you're in South Florida or the Panhandle or near Tampa, but you might see some of the ones that we have, and I want to get you excited about the ones we have by first showing just as a whole how amazing they can be. So again, a seabird is a term used to describe birds' key life histories, biological traits, and adaptations to saltwater, open ocean environments. This includes shearwaters, penguins, gulls, terns, tropic birds, frigate birds, and skimmers, just to name a few, but it does not include loons, grebes, sea ducks, and herons. Even though these birds can be seen in open ocean, they are not defined as seabirds because they do not have significant light history traits that are tied to the ocean. Loons and grebes and sea ducks actually breed in lakes, freshwater lakes, ponds, and freshwater environments, and then later in life they come out to the ocean. Meanwhile, seabirds, true seabirds is what we define them, breed by the ocean. They eat from the ocean, they migrate across the ocean. Everything is surrounded by salt water, and that's where their adaptations come in. They have webbed feet, they have waterproof plumage in some, but not all. Terns are actually not waterproof, even though they're considered a seabird because they forage at sea. They breed intercoastal, but they're actually not fully waterproof because they're not a diving species. But something such as a penguin or a booby or a gannet is fully waterproof just because that is the type of foraging strategy that they have. They have to get in the water. They have salt glands. They don't necessarily need to drink fresh water. They get everything that they need from the sea. These salt glands allow them to drink seawater without getting incredibly dehydrated like you or I could. And again, their diet consists of marine species, fish, krill, shrimp, squid, everything that just you could find on the ocean. And again, amazing stories can be told by seabirds. Looking at just a few, this is the Arctic tern. It is, it experiences the longest migration of any species that we have in the world. The Arctic tern goes all the way from the Antarctic to the Arctic and back again all within a year. And this map shows beautifully. This is obviously a project that has been done by backpacking these birds by putting oh my goodness, satellite transmitters on the back of these birds, which ping off of satellites and can give us geodata of where they have been and the path that they have taken. And you can see very clearly by these beautiful diagrams just how much open water this species covers. And from tip north to bottom south, just going, and obviously they do hit some land because they have to rest, but of just how much open ocean that this bird covers and that they never really outside of, I mean, there's one line, but they don't really go terrestrial. They don't really go over land pretty much at all. Same with the wandering albatross, which has an amazing life history. This was a study, a 6 year study done by um, backpacking, same little backpack, satellite backpack, wandering albatross, that shows you just how much time they spend at sea. And this species alone can spend up to 6 years at sea before returning to land to breed. They they just sit on the water, they fly, they forage, and they don't touch land until they are ready to come back, pair up, and lay eggs. But if anything, this is the pure definition of what it means to actually be considered a seabird. Now, going back to the other side, shorebirds. Again, more genetically related to one another, um, but they don't necessarily have the exact same life history traits as one another. They're found near water, but not specifically the shoreline, which can be a little confusing with their name. They can be found in intertidal mudflats. They can be found at sandy beaches, rocky coastlines, freshwater wetlands, grasslands, plowed field agriculture lands, flooded fields. Anywhere where there's some water that they can get to is usually where they're found. And this creates both physical and behavioral adaptations that better define that group. So here's a small diagram of basically the characteristics that are associated, and this is what's nice with them being so closely genetically, is that every single shorebird actually can exhibit these traits. So longbill can be debated with some of these birds. I don't know if a snowy plover can really have a bill about that big and be considered a long bill, but they're used in the exact same way as every other species that is called a shorebird in the way that it probes the sand for invertebrates. They all have the same foraging strategy, which is using that bill to identify and go in mud flats and go in sand and go in coastlines and forage for their food in that way. They have an upright stance. They have long toes. They have mottled plumage. They have pointed wings, and they have long, thin legs. All of, again, can be seen in every species of shorebird, no matter where you are in the world, which is really, really cool and definitely is neat to see in these shorebirds because of how vastly different seabirds can be to one another. Um, Again, they're found in wet environments, soft ground because they use that bill to probe their soil substrate to forage. They have a diet of invertebrates, and depending on what that is, that could be a worm if you're in freshwater. That could be a, sand flea if you're in saltwater, or an oyster that we see oyster catchers are very keen on. But they have an entire diet, mostly and usually consisting of invertebrates. That's not to say they've never been seen eating anything else. And again, that foraging strategy is the same across all species. And again, just because the Arctic tern kind of blows it out of the park with migration doesn't mean there's some amazing action happening in the shorebird group. Red knots go through an incredible migration. This is actually a species that you can see during the winter, that they come down from the north and they use Florida as a stopover point. Um, in Collier County specifically is a great place to look for red knots. As far as I know, working in the south of Florida, I'm sure there's plenty of other sites throughout Florida that you can find these, but there are a really sought after visitor for birders around the world, really. People will fly into Florida just to get a chance to look at a red knot for 2 minutes. And same thing, this is a map of a whimbrel in their migration. And this is a really great map to kind of compare how seabird migration and shorebird migration can look the same, but also differentiate in some very distinct ways. So, obviously, there's some movement over the open ocean, which is amazing stamina by whimbrels because they're not waterproof, so they're not stopping. Once they're over water, they're not stopping at all. But when you look at the map, specifically in these darker lines, you can see how they really hug the shoreline and they have so many stopover points going from South America all the way up to Alaska, where they really do stick to those either shorelines or they do go through the Atlantic Flyway as well as the one that goes through Texas and through the Rockies and through Canada, that they will go kind of in more freshwater environments. But when you compare it to the Arctic tern or the wandering albatross, look how close they stay to land. They're not going way out into the Pacific. They're not going way out into the Atlantic. They're sticking pretty close. You can see the entire map with just two continents in it. So, not to say that shorebirds never do insane migrations the way that seabirds do. They are absolutely indomitable in their own right, but this highlights beautifully how they don't do open ocean. They stay hugging these continents. Sadly, we're gonna get a little sad. Global trends of both are in decline. Recent studies suggest 70% decline in global seabird populations since the 1950s and 33% decline in global shorebird populations since the 1980s. But this map is a great, and take a look at this. I know there's a lot going on, but it's really easy to break down. Dots in all of these quadrants show number of studies and also species richness in the color. So obviously red around Australia, New Zealand, those are huge hotspots for seabirds. And this is just looking at seabird richness, not necessarily shorebird. But Australia and New Zealand have the highest richness globally, just knocks it out of the water. I think they have upwards of like 60 species of seabirds alone. Insane. But there's so much we don't know and we don't study. There's so many dots that we can see in these quadrants that they're not covered. because it's open ocean. It's hard to study the open ocean. And also it's countries that have, a lot of money, which necessarily goes into that they have the resources to do studies on these. Europe, US, even in South America, and off these other coasts, these huge biological, sinks, Madagascar, and even some of these little southward islands that are closer to the Antarctic. But there's so much out there that we actually haven't done a lot of studies on, which is really interesting because these are pretty charismatic birds. And like I said, people come from all over to look for these birds. And there's not a whole ton of studying going on. So that's just something else to keep in mind and I believe that obviously these declines are happening, but there's so much we still don't know about these birds because they're honestly pretty cryptic once they leave the shoreline and they go into open ocean, and it's hard to find something in the open ocean. So that being said, though, seabirds and shorebirds are really considered sentinels of their environments. And we're going to go back to seabirds and then flop to shorebirds. But seabirds, because they spend so much time in open ocean and they're so intertwined in that environment, and they get intertwined into even the fisheries department, fishing, commercial fisheries, they highlight unsustainable practices like bycatch. They highlight changes in ocean condition. There was a warm blob, what they called it, literally, look it up. They called it a warm blob off the coast of the Pacific not too long ago. Seabird populations plummeted. They went, what is going on? Looked at the water, realized there was a lot actually in decline because there was all of a sudden it got warmer by 5 degrees and everything kind of went out of whack for a little while. They highlight bacterial changes like red tide in South Florida. You can see how that affects birds by seeing mortality events. And overall, because they are able to highlight these areas that we may not otherwise see, because the ocean is again huge, because we are watching them, they actually can change things for the better. For longline fisheries and bottom troll, which if you know anything about fisheries, bottom trolling is pretty much devastating for everything. It is indiscriminatory for what it picks up. It's a huge net that they drag along the ocean floor, and it picks up everything. It will destroy coral. It will pick up bottom um, species as well as top species just in the water column, and it'll pull up everything and anything. And it doesn't even necessarily mean the target fish that they're trying to go for. They can pick up squids, octopus, shrimp, anything, including marine mammals and including seabirds. But we really didn't know this because it happened so far offshore. All of a sudden, bird population started declining, that it highlights these practices that we otherwise may not know about until we start studying what is happening above the water in order to understand what's happening below it. And there's this amazing story about wandering albatross. There's this colony that's just off New Zealand, and all of a sudden, in a while ago, this was like 2008, um, all of a sudden, every year, they'd study that same colony, females started going missing. All of a sudden, the female population from that island started going missing, and there was an uneven ratio of males to females. And when you want a population to increase, as we do with pretty much every species because it's in decline one way or another, you want females. No offense, but but you need females because they're the ones laying the eggs. And all of a sudden, when the females start going missing, population will plummet and plummet fast. So they did this study, and this is where this graph is from. They backpacked males and females. And then for a whole year, they saw the foraging patterns. Because again, these birds go off to sea, they don't touch land until they're ready to come back and breed. And all the females, they realized the females and males, the foraging patterns were completely different. Females forage, that's the red dot, forage closer to shore. Males will forage way out to sea. And that's what was happening, is that females saw an unproportional mortality and death by longline fisheries. They had a way higher rate of bycatch. Going back to this side to the left, that's longline fisheries. But in doing this study, they realized that they needed to come up with something in order to decrease bycatch because otherwise, very rapidly, this population could go extinct without any females to breed. So they came, engineers, biologists, commercial fisheries all came together. They came out with different solutions. Visual barriers, seabird exclusion devices. All of this wouldn't happen if we didn't study seabirds because we wouldn't even know this was happening. It would just be kind of something else that was part of it. You know, bycatch is just part of the fishing. Doesn't need to be though. So highlighting these unsustainable practices brings change into the world that we may not see, which is amazing. And again, Seabirds act as kind of a canary in a coal mine situation. If you see a decline of seabirds, then you might know that the fisheries, what's going on under the water, their prey source isn't there. So there's something going on in the fisheries that needs to be highlighted. If you see an increase, prey sources increasing. That may or may not be a good thing. Maybe there's something in the trophic system we need to look at. And this is obviously trends that happen with no external factors whatsoever, but they can highlight things that are happening under the water by studying what's happening above it. And the same can be said for shorebirds, which is, again, really amazing. They can highlight shoreline erosion. They can highlight key components of wetland ecosystems, chemical leaching into the water, which could then cause red tide. They could, looking at movements and looking at range expansion, can highlight climate shift. Because if there's warming up north and there's not as long as winters, their prey source then migrates up north and they follow it. So that can highlight what's going on under the soil that we're not necessarily seeing or looking at. But all of a sudden we're seeing shorebird populations decline completely, or we're just not seeing them anymore. They're going somewhere else. And why is that? Then we can start looking at soil health, and we can start looking at shoreline health, and we can start looking at why we're seeing an overall decline in habitat health when these birds aren't there. And there's this amazing story that happened in South Florida, of all places, in Lake Worth Lagoon, which is a city just under West Palm Beach. They, in this habitat, the U.S. Army Corps and Palm Beach County came together to create a project that would better intertidal and lagoon health after years and years and years of dredging practices. That in dredging up soil, they would create these huge pockets and caverns that would then just get filled with literally what they call muck, which is just this slime. Ugh. It's just this, it really is just slime. You can pick it up with your hand, it comes right out. It comes in because there's overflush of nitrogen and chemicals that might come from runoff from communities and then just dredging practices. And in the past, they clear cutted all of this. There are no mangroves, there are no oysters, there's no seagrass, there's nothing to naturally combat all of this that's happening. So there was just this buildup of muck without anything there. So they put out this huge project, started filling in those dredged holes that were filled with muck, filled it in, created intertidal habitat, planted mangroves, put in oyster reef balls to recruit oysters, encouraged seagrass growth, did all these surveys and just changed everything. You started seeing the health of the lagoon come back. And in seeing that, we got oyster catchers. We got American oyster catchers. So we saw a southward expansion of the American oyster catcher range, which was never there as far as we know. It could have been there hundreds of years before all this change and development happened, but we have no records of it until 2005. And the first oyster catchers came. And these guys, I will say, are incredibly picky. They only stick to the shoreline. They will not go into freshwater. They will not leave the coastline. And they only live in areas where there is true health in that ecosystem. So, in putting all this money and effort into this restoration project, they came. And for since 2005, we have had oyster catcher recruitment every single year. This picture, which we banned the chicks that come from this area, this picture was taken this year. And we had 4 pairs of oyster catchers in that area that produced 5 chicks overall. We banded each one of them. And we actually saw this year there was an attempt by a chick that we banded, I think back in 2022. So that baby came back and tried to start nesting. She failed. She's a little young. She'll get it. But we see that recruitment come back and we see that site, I'm kind of blanking out on the word, but you see past generations coming back to the same site rather than dispersing elsewhere. So amazing. And amazing that we can see true results of restoration efforts that honestly didn't even have shorebirds in mind, but that they act as key components to actually showcasing that it's working, that something we're doing is actually improving on the health of these environments. And the transitions, we finally made it into Florida. I hope by now you're kind of starting to warm up on them a little bit. If you weren't already, you could have come in this being like, I love birds. I don't know what she's talking about. But anyone else who, don't really see them in the best light, hopefully now you're kind of seeing that these guys are actually something to care about, and there's something that we do have on our coastlines that we put effort into managing and growing. So in Florida alone, the birds that I work with, because for FWC, I work with anything that is imperiled or declining. So the state threatened species in Florida are the American oyster catcher, is top left, the snowy plover, top right, black skimmer, which is bottom left, and then the least tern, which is bottom right. And in South Florida, we have all of these except the snowy plover. They don't typically come this far south, but they will be around Fort Myers area. They'll be around Tampa. They do come south, just not as far. And other birds to highlight in Florida are federally endangered roseate terns. That's the one on the left. And then Wilson's plovers, which we believe to be in decline, but there needs to be more studies so we can actually put them on the state threatened list. Wilson's plover is the one on the right. And the definition of state threatened compared to federally threatened or endangered is that only within the state of Florida do we see a decline in these species. So again, going back to the state threatened birds. Because they are state threatened, it does not mean that countrywide we see a decline. That's where federally endangered comes in. So roseate terns, we see a federal decline in the species. And those are usually under jurisdiction of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Not to say that we don't help, obviously, when needed, but they are under federal jurisdiction. So, again, I'm going to be talking about South Florida alone because that's just where I work. That's what I'm most familiar with. But anyone who is into ecotourism, anyone who's into birding, anyone who wants to become a steward of these birds, go on to the FSD. FSD stands for Florida Shorebird Database, if you don't already know about it. You can create a login for free, and you have access to all this information that you can see what beaches, you can see what rooftops and spaces in which these birds and these species are nesting that summer. In this, we don't only log state threatened species, we log anything. We log any type of shorebird or seabird that we have interest in. And that even goes to something like a killdeer. Even though they're not threatened in any way, we still like to have knowledge on that. So if you are an avid birder, feel free, create your own account and just explore the data. And you can even see near you if there's something that interests you. And following that, going into Collier County specifically, because I know Mike is located in Collier County. And overall, the west coast of Florida and the South region. Oh no, my battery is getting low. Hold on. I don't want to die. Um, anyway, the South region and west coast of the South region is where you're going to get the highest numbers of birds because there's just the most beach. Quetzalcoatlus Pass, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but that is the sandbar that is right south of all that development. But we are, we're back. We're back on track. I have my charger. No more delays. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you for being patient, everyone. Mishaps happen. So, going back to Florida, and South Florida specifically, in looking at some of the largest nesting sites that we have, really come to Quetzalcoatlus Pass, which, like I said, if you look at the map, is below the development, below Marco Island, in that first sandbar that is there, and then all the way past that large chunk of land that is labeled 10,000 Islands to that far sandbar that is called Second Chance. These two areas are part of our critical wildlife area program. Quetzalcoatlus, not so much as of now because it's a dynamic habitat, just like Second Chance, and it actually moved outside the borders of what we consider the critical wildlife area on paper. But nonetheless, they are our two largest nesting sites that we have in South Florida. And last year, big amount of black skimmers nested, and we saw just around, if not a little less than 35 chicks, and we actually were able to band those chicks last year. And then this year, nobody actually nested on Quetzalcoatlus, but we believe they moved down to Second Chance because we had record numbers of birds there this year. I think with kind of the drought that we've been having, the lack of hurricane weather that we have this year compared to what we have last year, of kind of those early onset tropical storms and hurricanes rolling through. But we got a number of less than 100 chicks of black skimmers. We banded around 60, just over 60, and we believe there to be probably over 80 chicks there in total that we just didn't even get to that night because we were losing light at the end of the day. We had over 10 chicks of Wilson's plovers, which is amazing. That's never even been seen on Second Chance before. So record numbers this year of Wilson plover chicks. And then also a great number of least turned chicks, just under 80, we think about within the 70 number range of least turned chicks that have gotten to the age that they have actually successfully come into adulthood and fledged from that island, which is what we're trying to see. We're trying to see increase in population to the breeding group in that species because that's how we get more. Um, and after I kind of talked about the marine challenges that seabirds and shorebirds may have, and even kind of how agriculture and chemicals, these can all be threats to seabirds and shorebirds. This doesn't mean that being a seabird doesn't mean that you lack terrestrial challenges. In Florida alone, we have 22 million residents and counting. We have 48 million visitors that engage in beach and waterfront activities. So that could be directly impacting or kind of directly um, having, impact on seabirds and shorebirds because they share this space. They come back to land in order to lay their eggs, and they will stay there for months at a time, trying to incubate those eggs, going out to forage, coming back and feeding the chicks until they get big enough to fly. And so human disturbance can come from beach raking, it can come from ATV use on the beach, and beach driving if you're driving your truck up and down. It can come from off-leash dogs that are chasing birds, just like the one that's chasing the skimmer in the photo. It can come from overcrowding. Sometimes there's so many people that the birds don't even have space to go. Sometimes we take over the beach and they don't have room to come lay their eggs, and they don't have room to come and do what they have to do. And even roost for terns and skimmers that aren't technically waterproof, and shorebirds that also aren't waterproof and they can't go and bob in the water. They don't have area that they can relax. They're just constantly on edge, and that stress can push them over the edge and can actually cause mortality events. Other challenges like invasive predators, other or invasive plants as well that can you take up the nesting habitat. Seabirds in certain skimmers and least terns, they like flat, no vegetation, just sand. Invasive vegetation can overgrow those spaces and again drive them out. Same with predation. Coyotes, even though they're natural, even though they're just kind of a natural part of the ecosystem, one coyote can just decimate a population. They can just decimate a colony. Not necessarily picking off adults because they can fly, but they're picking off eggs. They're picking off flightless young and chicks. And we've seen them just demolish a colony of 100+ birds and just completely push them out. And once the birds have in their head that this area, whether that come from coyotes, domesticated dogs, humans, once they have in their mind that this is not a safe place for me to raise my young, they will go somewhere else. So they might not be endangered, as in they might not exhibit an overall decline in the country, but they may be extirpated from Florida as a whole if these sites continue to be unusable. So that's kind of where we come in. That's where organizations like Audubon, the federal government, even county and city, they all come in to try to combat this. On the state level, we create critical wildlife areas which are set up. They can either be year-round or seasonal, just like Second Chance Island. That's a seasonal CWA, CWA meaning critical wildlife area. That's a seasonal CWA that's only closed off to the public when nesting is happening. And then once the birds naturally leave and migrate, that's open to the public. Posted areas are areas that are more dynamic. If there's a 50-mile stretch of beach, we can't make the entire public beach a critical wildlife area because then no one gets to use that public beach. Instead, we post the areas. So just like that sign says, I mean, that says critical wildlife area, but we have other signs that just say no entry, nesting happening, or terns seen in this area do not enter this space. We put in those signs, we tie rope around it, and those signs can be moved from year to year to kind of block off a sanctioned area where these birds come in, they use, and once the season is done, they leave. And then those posts are taken out, beach is open to the public. Outreach and education, just like what I'm doing right now. And what we continue to do pretty much year round is to educate beachgoers, but also educate anybody who's willing to sit here and listen on why we should care about these spaces and kind of when you see these postings, what do they actually mean? And how can you, as a responsible citizen who has respect for these birds, how can you understand what's going on here and give them the space that is needed for them to also share the beach with you? Beach stewards are also a way that we educate the public. These are volunteers, as well as they could work for a city or state. I consider myself a steward, even though I, work with an agency, I'm affiliated with an agency. But stewarding is a way to survey the beach, find where they're nesting, contact someone who has signs, talk to the people who are walking by, go, hey, there's birds over here. Let's go around. And again, that's just another way of outreach and education. And then predation management, which is what we do on the state level, which is either capturing and relocating an animal, if that can be done, or sometimes it is direct removal of the animal altogether. Um, okay, that's all. Thank you so much for your time. Again, thank you for being patient and waiting for me to come back here. But I hope at least you learned a little bit about today. I hope you learned something that you didn't know before, and I hope maybe you have a little bit more love for these animals that we do have the privilege of seeing pretty much year round. But next time you see a bird, and if you want to get more involved, please reach out to us. We have a volunteer program. Reach out to Audubon. They have an amazing volunteer program. Reach out to a local non-for-profit. And if you want to get involved, there's so many options for you to have. So thank you so, so much. And Mike, all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Taylor. If you would be so kind to please take the evaluation that I will re-put in the chat, and you can scan the QR code on the screen. Like I mentioned, this will be online, so tomorrow or either Friday morning, I'll send out an email that has some links that Taylor will send over or sent over, as well as a link to the recording and this. So the next webinar will actually be September 10th, like I mentioned, on the Florida Master Naturalist Program. And that is linked on the Florida Sea website, and I will send that again in the chat. And Taylor, we have a question actually in the chat right now. And I will go ahead and stop the recording, and anybody, you're free to unmute yourself and ask Taylor some more questions. But Taylor says, let's